November 1942, over the skies of Guadalcanal. Japanese pilots laughed when they first saw a strange, twin-tailed American fighter climbing toward them. They were certain it would be nothing more than easy prey for the mighty Zero. But within minutes, that laughter turned to fear. The P-38 Lightning, born from American ingenuity and industrial power, was about to rewrite the rules of air combat in the Pacific. The date was November 18, 1942. The location, above Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. At dawn, the tropical mist was just burning off the jungle canopy when a Japanese Zero pilot gripped his control stick tighter. His eyes narrowed through the canopy glass as he spotted something utterly unfamiliar climbing out of the airstrip below. It wasn't the stubby American Wildcat, nor the clumsy P-40s his squadron had been swatting out of the sky for months. No, what he saw seemed almost alien, a fighter with 2 engines, 2 tails, and a menacing profile that didn't belong in the skies of 1942. He banked his Zero for altitude, confident as ever. After all, the Mitsubishi A6M0 had reigned supreme since Pearl Harbor. Its lightweight, tight turns, and long range had given Japanese aviators near total dominance in the Pacific. Every pilot had been taught the same truth. No Allied fighter could climb or maneuver with the Zero. But this morning, that assumption began to crack. The strange American aircraft, later identified as the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, was not only climbing, it was climbing faster than his Zero. Within moments, the Americans had gained nearly 5,000 feet of altitude advantage. For the first time in 3 years of war, the Zero pilots were not dictating the terms of combat. Down below, the men of the 339th Fighter Squadron, green pilots flying their new mounts into combat for the first time, were executing their mission. Their orders were simple: escort bombers and engage any Japanese fighters encountered. What unfolded that morning would not only shock the enemy, it would begin rewriting the very mathematics of air combat. When the clash came, it was swift and merciless. The P-38s dove from above, their concentrated nose-mounted guns firing streams of 50 caliber bullets and 20mm shells. In the span of minutes, 3 Japanese aircraft fell burning into the waters off Guadalcanal. The Zero pilot who survived that day later wrote in his after-action report, sent back to Rabaul, "Twin engines, twin tails, climbing like nothing we have seen." It was a confession of disbelief, a first crack in the myth of Japanese invincibility. For the first time since December 7, 1941, the Empire's most trusted weapon had been outclimbed, outgunned, and outflown. That day, above Guadalcanal, the Zero's reign began to crumble, and the Americans, with their ungainly twin-tailed Lightning, had just announced that the Pacific skies were no longer a Japanese domain. For nearly 3 years before that November morning over Guadalcanal, the Japanese Zero was a legend in the skies. In 1940, when it first appeared over China, Allied pilots couldn't believe what they were facing. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was light, agile, and deadly in the hands of highly trained Japanese aviators. In the opening months of the Pacific War, it tore through Allied aircraft with terrifying ease. At Pearl Harbor, at Singapore, over the jungles of Burma, and across the Philippines, wherever the Zero appeared, it seemed unstoppable. The British Brewster Buffalo was slaughtered. The American P-40 Warhawk was outclimbed and outturned, and even the famous British Hurricane found itself at a deadly disadvantage. The statistics told the story. With a maximum speed of about 330 miles per hour, the Zero could keep pace with most Allied fighters of the early war. More importantly, it could outturn anything in the sky. A Zero could get inside an opponent's turning circle in seconds, forcing them into a hopeless position. And with its long range, nearly 1,600 miles on internal fuel, it could strike targets far beyond the reach of American or British fighters. But the Zero's strength came at a cost. To achieve its agility and range, Japanese engineers sacrificed what Western designers considered essential: armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks. The Zero was fast and nimble, but also fragile. A single burst of machine gun fire could ignite its fuel and turn the sleek fighter into a fireball. Of course, Japanese pilots didn't dwell on these weaknesses. They had something else, a philosophy. The Imperial Navy trained its aviators with almost fanatical discipline, honing them into elite warriors who believed themselves superior to any opponent. Among the most famous was Petty Officer First Class Saburo Sakai, a veteran of the China campaign and one of Japan's top aces. He entered the Pacific War with dozens of kills already under his belt, his confidence absolute. His commander, Lieutenant Junichi Sasai, told his men before combat over Guadalcanal, "The Americans fly carrier-based fighters. Wildcats, perhaps, not army planes. You have defeated them before. You will defeat them again." And why shouldn't they believe it? In early 1942, Zero pilots cut through Allied squadrons like a scythe through dry grass. In Java, in the Philippines, and across the South Pacific, Allied losses mounted at an alarming pace. The psychological edge belonged entirely to Japan. By the summer of 1942, Zero pilots carried themselves with the certainty of men who believed in their own invincibility. They laughed at the slow American Wildcats, toyed with British Hurricanes, and dismissed rumors of new American fighters as little more than desperate propaganda. So when the first reports trickled in about a twin-tailed, twin-engined American fighter, the very plane that would soon shock them above Guadalcanal, most Japanese officers waved it off. A two-engine plane, too heavy, too clumsy, no match for the nimble Zero. But war has a cruel way of exposing arrogance. And as we saw in Chapter 1, the myth of the Zero's superiority would shatter the moment it encountered the P-38 Lightning climbing higher, faster, and striking with a new kind of power. The stage was set. The laughter of Japanese pilots would soon give way to disbelief. By mid-1942, Japanese pilots were still laughing at the idea of a twin-engine fighter. To them, it was absurd. In their doctrine, speed and agility required lightness. A fighter with two engines was, by definition, too heavy, too clumsy, and too slow to survive against the nimble Zero. But thousands of miles away, in a quiet corner of California, American engineers had built something that would prove them dead wrong. The fighter in question, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, was unlike anything the world had seen. With its twin booms stretching back from the engines and a central pod for the cockpit, it looked more like something from science fiction than a product of the 1930s. Pilots who first saw it called it the fork-tailed devil. The story of the Lightning began in February 1937, when the U.S. Army issued a daring request: design a fighter that could fly faster than 360 miles per hour, climb to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes, and carry heavy armament. Most experts thought it was impossible, but a young designer at Lockheed named Clarence Kelly Johnson believed otherwise. Johnson was only in his 20s, but he already had a reputation for bold ideas. His team sketched out a radical solution. Instead of one powerful engine, why not two? Instead of mounting guns in the wings, why not place them all in the nose? The result was a machine with two turbo-supercharged Allison engines, each producing over 1,000 horsepower, giving the P-38 unmatched performance at high altitude. At a time when most fighters struggled to hold speed above 20,000 feet, the Lightning could soar to 40,000 feet and cruise for over 1,000 miles. It was not just fast, it was revolutionary. 400 mph top speed, faster than anything Japan had. Twin-engine reliability, meaning a pilot could survive even if one engine failed. Concentrated firepower, 4 50-caliber machine guns, and a 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose. This was a completely different philosophy from the Zero. Where Japanese engineers had stripped away armor and fuel protection in search of agility, the Americans embraced weight, power, and survivability. Of course, the Lightning wasn't perfect. Early versions suffered from mechanical problems, cooling issues, unfamiliar handling, and maintenance difficulties delayed its combat debut. In Australia, the first squadron struggled to keep them flying. But once those problems were ironed out, the P-38 offered something no Allied fighter had yet provided: the ability to fight the Zero on entirely new terms. Back in the Pacific, Japanese commanders were still dismissing reports. A two-engine fighter cannot turn. It cannot fight, they assured their men. Pilots repeated this with confidence, convinced that doctrine and experience were on their side. They had no idea that the Americans weren't planning to fight them in turning duels anymore. The era of swirling dogfights was ending. A new era, defined by altitude, speed, and firepower, was about to begin, and it would begin violently in the skies over Guadalcanal. November 18th, 1942. The jungle below was steaming in the morning heat when the American pilots of the 339th Fighter Squadron took off from Henderson Field. Their assignment was routine on paper: escort a formation of B-17 Flying Fortress bombers headed north. But every man in the cockpit knew it was anything but routine. This would be the first combat mission of the P-38 Lightning against Japanese fighters. The Lightning's twin engines roared as they climbed out over the Solomon Sea. Inside the cockpits, young pilots, many only months removed from training, adjusted oxygen masks, scanned the skies, and gripped control sticks with sweaty hands. Some were veterans of P-40 units, hardened by brutal lessons learned the hard way: never dogfight a Zero on its own terms. At nearly the same moment, Japanese escort pilots spotted them. From the sun's glare, strange silhouettes appeared: twin tails, wide wings, climbing with startling speed. Confusion spread over the Japanese formation. Were these bombers? Reconnaissance aircraft? Surely not fighters. By the time realization struck, it was already too late. The P-38s had reached a position the Zero pilots couldn't match, 5,000 feet above them. From that altitude, the Americans held the advantage of speed, gravity, and surprise. The order came over the radios: Lightnings, break and attack. What followed was nothing like the swirling dogfights of 1941. Instead of turning battles, the P-38s dived like hawks, each pilot selecting a target and unleashing a concentrated storm of 50 caliber fire and 20mm shells from the nose. Unlike wing-mounted guns, which required precise convergence, the Lightning's weapons struck with surgical accuracy. In seconds, the air was filled with chaos. One Zero erupted in flames, spiraling into the sea. Another disintegrated under the impact of multiple cannon rounds. A third tried to climb, desperate to escape, only to stall as a Lightning slashed past and tore its wing to shreds. The battle was over almost as quickly as it began. 3 Japanese aircraft destroyed, not a single P-38 lost. For the Americans, it was more than a tactical victory. It was validation that their strange, heavy, twin-tailed fighter could not only hold its own, but dominate when used properly. For the Japanese, it was a rude awakening. Reports from survivors spoke of confusion, disbelief, even fear. The Zero's legendary turning ability had been useless against opponents who refused to play the old game. That morning above Guadalcanal, the rules of aerial warfare had changed. The Americans had written a new formula: altitude plus speed plus firepower = victory. The myth of Zero superiority, so carefully cultivated through 3 years of war, had begun to crumble. And the Japanese pilots knew deep down that this was only the beginning. By the end of 1942, the P-38 Lightning had proven itself over Guadalcanal. But victory in one skirmish didn't mean the war in the air was won. American pilots still had to learn how to use this strange new fighter properly. The lesson came hard and fast. Men who transitioned from P-40s and Wildcats brought with them habits shaped by bitter experience. They knew the golden rule when facing the Zero: never, ever try to turn with it. That truth carried over into the P-38. But now, for the first time, they had an aircraft that could dictate the fight. The lightning wasn't about graceful maneuvers, it was about raw power. It was about climbing higher, diving faster, and hitting harder than anything the Japanese had ever faced. One squadron commander put it plainly during a briefing. "Don't dogfight them. You'll lose. Use your weight. Use your speed. Use your guns. Fight on your terms, not theirs." And that became the philosophy of the P-38. Instead of swirling dogfights, P-38 pilots perfected a new tactic, the boom and zoom. They climbed above their enemy, waited for the right moment, and then plunged down like an eagle striking prey. With throttles wide open, the twin Allison engines howled as the Lightning accelerated into a near-vertical dive. At speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, the Zero simply couldn't follow. Its controls locked up at high speed, leaving it helpless. The P-38, on the other hand, could still maneuver. With hydraulically boosted controls in later models, it remained deadly even in high-speed dives. This was a revelation for young American pilots who had once been at the mercy of Japanese agility. Now they could slash, strike, and climb away before the Zero pilots even had time to react. The change in tactics transformed the battlefield. A Zero pilot who once laughed at clumsy American planes now found himself staring up at contrails far above his reach. He knew the danger. At any moment, one of those contrails might fold downward into a screaming dive, and by the time he saw the Lightning's guns flash, it would already be too late. For the Americans, it was a matter of confidence. In the early months of the war, they had felt like underdogs fighting for survival. Now, in the cockpit of a P-38, they carried something new, the certainty that they had the tools to win. The war in the air was no longer a contest of tight turns and daring maneuvers. It had become a battle of altitude, speed, and firepower, and in that battle, the Lightning reigned supreme. But perhaps the most shocking difference was yet to come, not in how the P-38 flew, but in how it fought. With all of its guns mounted in the nose, the Lightning delivered a kind of firepower the Japanese had never faced before. And in the next chapter, we'll see how one burst of concentrated American fire could shatter even the most experienced Zero ace. If altitude gave the Lightning the advantage, its firepower sealed the deal. Most fighters of World War II carried their guns in the wings. This meant pilots had to set a convergence range, a specific distance at which the bullets from both wings would cross paths. Hit outside that range, and the firepower scattered, sometimes harmlessly. The P-38 Lightning was different. All of its weapons, 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, were mounted in the nose. No convergence required. When a Lightning pilot squeezed the trigger, every round traveled in a single devastating stream of lead and explosive shells straight ahead. Imagine being in the cockpit of a Zero the first time you faced that. At 300 yards, you might normally expect a spray of bullets, some wide, some off-target. Instead, what came at you from the Lightning was like standing in front of a fire hose of destruction. American pilots quickly learned what that meant in combat. One burst, sometimes lasting no more than 2 seconds, could tear a Japanese fighter apart. A Zero's light frame, built for agility but lacking armor and self-sealing tanks, simply disintegrated under the concentrated impact. Wings snapped, engines exploded, fuel tanks ignited in brilliant fireballs. Veteran Japanese aces who had survived dozens of dogfights suddenly found themselves caught off guard. Their skill at turning inside an opponent meant nothing if the opponent refused to play the game. A Lightning diving from above didn't need to maneuver into position. It just lined up its nose, fired a concentrated burst, and then was gone. American gunners compared it to using a rifle instead of a shotgun. Accuracy, precision, and overwhelming stopping power, all packed into one aircraft. One P-38 pilot later recalled, "When those guns spoke, it was like a hammer hitting glass. You could see the Zero come apart under you. 1 second he was flying, the next he was just gone." For Japanese pilots, it was a nightmare. Their Zeros carried only two 7.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons with limited ammunition. Against the rugged Lightning, their fire often wasn't enough to bring down the big American fighter. But when the P-38 returned fire, the results were catastrophic. This was more than just technology. It was philosophy. The Zero embodied sacrifice. No armor, no protection, speed at all costs. The Lightning embodied American industry and design, speed, firepower, and survivability combined. And that difference in philosophy was now being written in burning wreckage across the skies of the Pacific. But the true power of the Lightning went beyond guns and engines. It was psychological. By early 1943, Japanese pilots no longer saw themselves as hunters. They began to feel like prey. And in the next chapter, we'll explore how that shift, the collapse of confidence, spread like wildfire through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Navy's finest aviators. For 3 years, Japanese pilots carried themselves with the swagger of men who believed they owned the skies. The Zero had made them kings of the Pacific. But by early 1943, that confidence was starting to crack, and the culprit was the Lightning. It wasn't just the numbers. It wasn't just that more Zeros were falling to American guns. It was something deeper, a creeping sense of vulnerability. Letters home, preserved after the war, show it clearly. One pilot wrote to his brother, "We no longer know from where the Americans will strike. The Lightning comes from above, from behind, from nowhere. We hear nothing, and then suddenly our comrades are gone." That silence was part of the terror. Thanks to its turbo-supercharged engines, the P-38 often approached quietly, its exhaust muffled. Japanese pilots, accustomed to hearing the roar of enemy aircraft before seeing them, found themselves under attack without warning. Suddenly, the familiar tricks that had worked against Wildcats and P-40s failed. The tight turns, the feints, the dogfight spirals. None of it mattered when the enemy refused to play along. The Lightning was rewriting the very rules of air combat, and the Japanese knew it. Even the greatest of them, Saburo Sakai, admitted it. After facing the P-38, he confessed that the Zero could only win under the most unusual conditions, conditions which seldom present themselves. Coming from Japan's most celebrated ace, that was devastating. The change showed up in tactics. Japanese squadrons that once attacked aggressively now hesitated, circling warily, watching the skies above. Pilots who once hunted now found themselves hunted. That psychological shift was as important as any technical advantage. One Zero veteran described his frustration after a near-fatal encounter. "I was behind an American fighter, ready to fire, but before I could squeeze the trigger, another came from the side. They fly like wolves, always two together. I had no choice but to dive away. When I returned to base, my hands still shook." For men trained to see themselves as warriors of a divine empire, the realization was crushing. They were no longer feared, but outmatched. The aura of invincibility that had carried the Japanese Navy across the Pacific was gone. And once that confidence broke, it spread like wildfire. Pilots whispered in mess halls, wrote in journals, and confided in each other that the Americans now held the upper hand. But the most painful revelation was still ahead. It wasn't just the tactics or the firepower of the Lightning, it was its range. The P-38 could appear almost anywhere, striking deep into Japanese territory. And that is where we turn next, to the Lightning's reach, and how it allowed America to carry the fight to places the Zero had once considered untouchable. By 1943, the Japanese had grown used to fighting close to home. Their Zeros had long legs for a fighter, about 1,600 miles on internal fuel, but even that had limits. When they launched raids, they carefully planned fuel, distance, and reserves. They believed the Americans could never match that reach. After all, the P-40 Warhawk and the F-4F Wildcat were short-legged, confined to operations near carriers or island bases. To Japanese commanders, the Pacific was their domain, a vast ocean where distance itself was a weapon. But then came the Lightning. With its twin engines and space for large external tanks, the P-38 could fly farther than any other American fighter of the war, over 1,600 miles with drop tanks. That meant it could go anywhere the bombers went, from deep strike missions to long-range patrols. Suddenly, American fighters weren't tied to the carriers. They weren't chained to island airstrips. They could roam far and wide, escorting bombers on missions deep into Japanese-held territory. To the men in the cockpits, it meant something personal, survival. Bomber crews who once flew alone into enemy skies now looked out their windows and saw Lightning escorts sliding into formation beside them. Twin tails glinting in the sun, a silent promise that this time they wouldn't be abandoned. For the Japanese, the effect was devastating. They had built their strategy on the assumption that their fighters would always enjoy the advantage of distance, that Allied bombers would arrive tired, unescorted, and vulnerable. Instead, they now faced fresh American fighters diving out of the sun, still carrying enough fuel to fight and return home. One Japanese pilot later admitted in an interview, "We thought the ocean was our shield. The Lightning crossed it as if it were nothing." That reach changed everything. Lightning squadrons could strike from bases in Australia into New Guinea, from Guadalcanal into the Northern Solomons, and later from the Central Pacific Islands into the very heart of Japanese defenses. It wasn't just tactical, it was strategic. The P-38 erased the advantage of geography that Japan had relied on since 1941. No airfield was truly safe, no convoy beyond reach. And soon, that extraordinary range would make possible one of the most audacious missions of the entire war, a mission that would alter the course of the Pacific and shake the Japanese high command to its core. The mission was called Operation Vengeance, April 18, 1943. Dawn broke over the Solomon Sea, casting long shadows across the water. 16 P-38 Lightnings skimmed just above the waves, engines throttled back to avoid detection. And their mission was so secret, so audacious, that the men flying it knew one thing for certain: if they failed, the course of the war could change. Their target was not a convoy, not a warship, not even a bomber formation. It was a single man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and the most respected strategist in the Imperial Japanese Navy. American intelligence had intercepted his travel plans. Yamamoto, confident as ever, was scheduled to fly from Rabaul to Bougainville, inspecting frontline units. The Japanese had no idea their codes had been cracked. For once, America had the chance not just to fight the enemy, but to cut off its head. But there was a problem. Bougainville was more than 400 miles from the nearest American base, far beyond the reach of any fighter except the Lightning. Only the P-38 had the range to escort itself out, make the strike, and return. So, at 7:25 a.m., flying at wave-top height to avoid radar, the Lightnings made their approach. The pilots were tense, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the target. Sweat ran down their faces despite the cool slipstream. They were flying into history. At 9:34 a.m., the moment came. Lookouts spotted two Japanese Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, escorted by 6 Zero fighters, approaching Bougainville. Yamamoto was in one of those bombers. The Americans climbed sharply from sea level, throttles wide open, engines screaming. Surprise was total. The escorts were caught flat-footed, still reeling from the sudden appearance of enemy fighters so far from base. Major John Mitchell, leading the mission, barked over the radio, "Tally-ho, let's get them." Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber dove headlong into the formation. Lanphier fired first, his 50 calibers and 20mm cannon ripping into the lead Betty. Flames engulfed its engines, and within seconds it plummeted into the jungle below. Yamamoto's plane, the second bomber, tried to escape, chased by Barber's Lightning. After a running battle at treetop level, it too went down, smashing into the forest canopy. Both Japanese transports were destroyed. Admiral Yamamoto, the man who had once warned his government that America was a sleeping giant, would never awaken from that jungle crash. For the Japanese, it was a blow beyond measure. The loss of their most brilliant strategist was not just military, it was psychological. Morale faltered, confidence cracked. If the Americans could reach this far, strike this precisely, and kill this man, what else were they capable of? For the Americans, it was vindication. A carefully planned, perfectly executed mission that demonstrated the full potential of the Lightning's range, speed, and firepower. A mission only the P-38 could have flown. That April morning, the fork-tailed devil had done the impossible. It had changed the war with a single strike. By 1943, the Japanese pilots who once laughed at the P-38 Lightning had stopped laughing. They had seen it climb higher, dive faster, and shoot straighter than anything they had ever faced. But what truly shocked them was something they couldn't see from the cockpit, something even more terrifying than the Lightning's guns. America could build them by the thousands. At Lockheed's plant in Burbank, California, the assembly lines never slept. Day and night, riveters, machinists, and engineers turned raw aluminum into sleek, twin-tailed fighters. The production floor echoed with the clang of tools, the hiss of welding torches, and the thunder of engines being tested. Each Lightning was a marvel of modern engineering. Over 5,000 individual parts, hundreds of miles of wiring, and thousands of rivets. Yet the Americans learned to turn them out at astonishing speed. A new P-38 rolled off the line every 90 minutes. Meanwhile, in Japan, fighter production looked very different. Many aircraft were still hand-built in workshops, with limited machinery and skilled labor stretched thin. Factories produced in the hundreds what America produced in the tens of thousands. The contrast was staggering. In 1943 alone, the US produced 85,000 aircraft. Japan, in the same year, built fewer than 16,000. And America wasn't just building planes, it was replacing losses faster than Japan could even train new pilots. To the men flying the Lightning, these numbers meant security. If one squadron took heavy losses, replacements would be waiting within weeks. Spare parts, engines, even entire airframes could be shipped across the Pacific in Liberty ships and delivered to frontline units. For Japanese pilots, the opposite was true. They watched their squadrons dwindle, their veteran comrades shot down with no replacements coming. By 1944, it was not uncommon for an American unit to meet green Japanese pilots who had fewer than 100 hours of flight training. The empire simply couldn't keep up. The industrial divide was more than statistics. It was visible proof of America's strength. German and Japanese prisoners alike were stunned when they saw the scale of US factories. One captured officer later recalled, "We thought we understood American industry. We were wrong. You did not build machines. You built an avalanche." That avalanche was what the Lightning represented. Not just a plane, but the embodiment of a nation's ability to outthink, outbuild, and outlast its enemies. And for Japanese pilots who once believed themselves invincible, the realization was crushing. They weren't just fighting airplanes. They were fighting the full weight of American democracy, industry, and ingenuity. But perhaps the most telling part of this story wasn't in the factories. It was in the skies. Because by the summer of 1944, the once laughed-at P-38 was no longer a curiosity. It had become something else entirely, a nightmare that Japanese pilots feared to face. And that transformation, from laughter to fear, is the story of our next chapter. At the start of the war, Japanese pilots laughed when they first heard about the P-38 Lightning. A twin-engine fighter, too heavy, too awkward. They nicknamed it two planes joined by a bridge, and some even called it a clumsy dragonfly. But by 1944, no one was laughing. The Lightning had earned a new nickname in the Pacific, the two-tailed devil. And it wasn't the Americans who coined it. It was the Germans and Japanese who had learned the hard way what those twin tails meant. For Japanese pilots, the P-38 became a shape to dread. The wide wings, the long fuselage, the unmistakable twin booms, once dismissed as strange, were now instantly recognized as deadly. Whenever those forked tails appeared high above, a chill ran through even the most experienced Zero Ace. They had good reason to fear. The lightning dove faster than anything they had. Its nose-mounted guns tore through aircraft with surgical precision. Its range allowed it to appear in places once considered safe. Worse still, the Americans had learned how to fly it properly. Squadrons no longer lost planes in turning duels. Instead, they worked in pairs, in groups, in whole formations that seemed to move with uncanny coordination. The Japanese pilots who once hunted alone found themselves overwhelmed by a pack of predators, striking together, then vanishing into the sky. A veteran Japanese flyer later admitted, "The lightning was like a ghost. It came from nowhere, struck without mercy, and disappeared before we could fight back." Even propaganda couldn't cover the truth. In 1942, newspapers in Tokyo bragged about the Zero's invincibility. By 1944, silence replaced the boasting. The losses were too great, the defeats too obvious. For the Americans, the change was tangible. Pilots who once entered combat nervous now took to the skies with confidence. They could see it in the way the enemy reacted, hesitating, breaking away, diving for cover. The hunter had become the hunted, and the lightning, once mocked as clumsy, had become a legend. But the story of the P-38 doesn't end with fear. It ends with legacy, with the recognition that this twin-tailed fighter represented something greater than just an aircraft. It represented American ingenuity, industry, and determination. And in our final chapter, we'll look at that legacy, the mark the lightning left on the war and on the men who flew it. When the war began, few could have imagined that a twin-tailed fighter, mocked as clumsy and strange, would become one of the most feared machines in the Pacific. Yet by 1945, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning had carved its name into history. It was there at Guadalcanal, proving the Zero was no longer invincible. It was there at Bougainville, striking Admiral Yamamoto from the sky in one of the most daring missions of the war. It was there over the Philippines, New Guinea, and the Marianas, escorting bombers on long missions that carried the war ever closer to Japan's doorstep. And it was always recognizable. Those forked tails glinting in the sun, a shape that came to symbolize the shift in the Pacific Air War. The Lightning wasn't perfect. Pilots wrestled with compressibility dives, struggled with engine maintenance in tropical climates, and mourned comrades lost in training and combat. But when mastered, the P-38 was a revelation, fast, powerful, and deadly in skilled hands. Its legacy wasn't only in numbers, though the numbers speak volumes. Lightning pilots claimed more than 10,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. America's two top aces of the war, Richard Bong with 40 victories and Thomas Maguire with 38, both flew the P-38. But the true legacy was something larger. It showed the world what American ingenuity could achieve. The Lightning was a marriage of radical design, bold engineering, and the industrial might of a democracy that could build not just fighters, but entire fleets of them. It was proof that in this war, innovation and production would triumph over arrogance and overconfidence. For the Japanese pilots who once laughed, the P-38 was a harsh teacher. For the Americans who flew it, it was a lifeline, an aircraft that could carry them farther, strike harder, and bring them home again. And for history, it remains a symbol. A reminder that in the darkest days of the war, when the outcome was still uncertain, a strange twin-tailed fighter helped turn laughter into fear and fear into victory. So when we look back now, decades later, the lesson of the Lightning is clear. Never underestimate the power of innovation, the strength of free people, and the will to fight for something greater than yourself. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, then please like, share, and subscribe. Together, we'll keep these voices from fading into silence. History is more than dates and battles. It's the human stories hidden behind them. What do you think about the Lightning's journey from a plane once mocked to a fighter that changed the war? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you want to keep discovering untold stories like this, Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join me for the next journey into World War II history. The past still speaks, if we choose to listen.